The morning of the wedding arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that makes people pull their coats tighter and wonder if the world is trying to tell them something. For Alina Ashford, standing in front of a small mirror in a room she had slept in since childhood, the weather felt exactly right. She was 26 years old, and no one had ever described her as beautiful. Not unkindly, simply honestly. She had steady gray eyes, a sharp mind, and hands that were always busy with a book or a letter. She was the kind of woman people overlooked at a party, then remembered much later when the conversation had grown dull and they found themselves wishing she were still nearby. But in the world she lived in, the polished, performance-driven world of 1880s English society, being overlooked was almost the same as not existing at all. Her sister Cecilia was the one who existed. Cecilia was golden-haired, soft-spoken, and exactly the kind of woman that men wrote poems about. She was also the woman who was supposed to be standing in Alina's place that morning, preparing to marry Edward Hale, the Duke of Wexford, a man of enormous wealth, sharp reputation, and absolutely no patience for things that did not go as planned. But Cecilia was not there. She had left the night before, quietly and without looking back. A short note on her pillow, 3 lines long, explained that she had gone to be with Captain James Whitmore of the 3rd Cavalry, a man she had loved in secret for 2 years and could no longer pretend not to love. She was sorry. She hoped everyone would understand. She was not coming back. Alina had found the note at 5 in the morning when she went to wake her sister. She read it twice. Then she sat on the edge of Cecilia's empty bed and breathed slowly until the shock settled into something more manageable. Her father found her there 20 minutes later. Lord Ashford was a tall man who had once been proud and now wore his debts in the deep lines of his face. He read the note, and for a moment Alina thought he might collapse entirely. He sat beside her, put the note down on the mattress between them, and said nothing for a long time. "The Duke will be at the church in 4 hours, he finally said. "I know," Alina replied. "If there is no bride, he will withdraw the arrangement. The contracts will dissolve. The creditors will move within the week." He paused, and his voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "We will lose everything, Alina. The house, the land, the servants who have worked here their whole lives, everything." Alina looked at her father's hands, the same hands that had taught her to hold a pen, that had carried her on his shoulders when she was small, that now rested in his lap trembling slightly. She thought about Mrs. Hall, the housekeeper, who was 63 and had nowhere else to go. She thought about the young stable hand, Thomas, who had a wife and a new baby. She thought about all the invisible people whose lives were held together by the framework of this estate. Then she looked at the white wedding dress still hanging on the wardrobe door, the dress that had been made for Cecilia, who was 2 inches shorter and slightly more delicate in the shoulders. It would not fit perfectly. "I will need extra pins," Alina said quietly. Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with something she did not want to name. "Alina, do not thank me," she said, standing up. "Just send for the maid and do not say a word of this to anyone, not yet." The dress was adjusted as best it could be. Alina's dark hair was pinned beneath the veil with careful hands. When she looked in the mirror one final time before leaving the room, she barely recognized herself, not because she looked beautiful, but because she looked like someone walking toward something very difficult with her eyes open. She thought that was honest enough. The church was full. St. Margaret's in Westminster could hold 300 people, and it seemed as though all 300 seats had been taken. The guests were a collection of England's most powerful and influential families, earls with ancestral estates, members of Parliament in their finest coats, ladies whose jewels caught the candlelight and scattered it across the stone walls. Everyone had come to see the famous Ashford beauty become a duchess. The whispers began the moment Alina stepped through the doors. She heard them, soft, puzzled murmurs running through the pews like a current. People leaned toward one another. Heads turned. Fans were raised. But Alina kept her eyes on the altar at the far end of the aisle, and she walked as if the whispers were simply the sound of wind through trees. She had learned, over 26 years of being the unremarkable sister, how to move through spaces where she was not entirely welcome. Edward Hale, the Duke of Wexford, was standing at the altar with his back half-turned to the aisle. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark coat that fitted him with military precision. He had dark hair, touched with the faintest gray at his temples, and a manner that suggested he had never in his life been uncertain about anything. He turned when he heard the organ begin. He watched the veiled figure come toward him, measured step, steady posture, the dress moving quietly on the stone floor. He noted that she was a different height than he had expected. He noted that her posture was different too, not the graceful float he had been told to expect, but something more grounded, more deliberate. He said nothing. He had agreed to this marriage for reasons that had nothing to do with affection, and he had not expected affection to arrive at the altar with it. The ceremony moved through its steps without interruption. The old priest, who had performed more weddings than he could count and had long since stopped being surprised by anything, read the words with steady authority. The congregation was unusually quiet. Even the children seated near the back seemed to sense that something was slightly unusual without being able to name what it was. Then came the moment. The priest nodded gently toward the Duke. It was time to lift the veil. Edward Hale reached forward. His hands were steady. He was not a man given to nerves, and he lifted the lace in one clean motion. The church went completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of reverence, but the sharp, sudden silence of an entire room holding its breath at the same time. The woman before him had gray eyes, not blue, dark hair, not golden, a face that was composed and clear and looking directly at him without flinching or looking away, without the pretty blush of shyness or the wide-eyed performance of a woman who wished to impress. She was simply watching him, waiting. He knew immediately that she was not Cecilia Ashford. He could hear the murmur beginning to rise behind him, the rustle of fabric, the intake of breath, the barely contained sound of 300 people realizing simultaneously that something extraordinary had just occurred. The woman before him spoke first. Her voice was low, calm, and intended only for him. "I know this is not what you expected, Your Grace. You have every right to say so out loud. I will not argue and I will not make a scene. Whatever you decide, I will accept it." He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. He had been deceived. There was no question about that. He felt the heat of it, the cold, controlled anger that came to him whenever he was placed in a situation he had not chosen. He was a man who chose everything deliberately. He had chosen this marriage deliberately, for reasons of political alignment and family name, and someone had tried to maneuver him like a piece on a board. But the woman in front of him had not looked away. In his experience, almost everyone looked away from him eventually. His wealth made people nervous. His title made people obedient. His directness made people uncomfortable. He had grown accustomed to a world in which people performed around him, said the things they thought he wanted to hear, stood the way they thought he wanted them to stand. He could not remember the last time someone had simply looked at him plainly and told him the truth. He made his decision. He extended his arm. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a declaration, just the quiet, deliberate offering of his arm to the woman standing before him. Alina looked at his arm, then she placed her hand on it. The priest, who had indeed seen everything in his long career, cleared his throat softly and continued the ceremony. The church did not stay silent. It erupted not in protest, but in the buzzing, breathless chaos of people who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for the rest of their lives. Ladies pressed gloves to their mouths. A lord in the third row turned to his wife with an expression of complete astonishment. Somewhere near the back, someone laughed not unkindly, but with the helpless laughter of someone who had not seen that coming. Lord Ashford, standing near the rear of the church, exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. The registry was signed. The papers were witnessed. Eleanor Ashford became, by the full and legal authority of the Church of England, the Duchess of Wexford. They did not speak until they were in the carriage, moving through the grey London streets toward Wexford House. "You will tell me everything," the Duke said. His voice was even. Not angry, or rather the anger was there but held tightly in check, the way a fire is held in a grate. "Yes," Eleanor said, "I will." And she did. She told him about the note, about her father's face, about the servants and the debts, and the decision she had made sitting on the edge of her sister's empty bed. She told him without excusing it or apologizing too much, simply laying out the facts clearly, the way she would have written them down if she were writing them. When she finished, the Duke was quiet for some time. "You chose to do this," he said finally, "not because you wanted the title, not because you wanted me." "No," Eleanor said honestly, "I did not know you." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but something close to it. "That is the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in recent memory." The weeks that followed were careful and quiet. Wexford House was large and somewhat cold, the kind of house that had been maintained with perfect precision for so long that it had forgotten how to feel lived in. Eleanor moved through it observantly, learning its rhythms, speaking to the staff with the easy directness of someone who had grown up in a working household and understood that a house ran on the dignity of the people inside it. She met with the estate steward on the second day and corrected 2 errors in his accounting without being asked. She organized the library, which had been in a state of beautiful disorder, into a system so logical that the Duke's secretary, who had worked at Wexford House for 11 years, came to her desk to say quietly that he wished someone had done it a decade ago. She did not try to charm the Duke. She did not redecorate his study or insert herself into his decisions or attempt to soften the edges of their unusual situation with social performance. She simply lived her days with the same clear purpose she had always brought to everything, and when she and the Duke sat across from each other at dinner, which they did every evening because he was a man who valued routine, she spoke honestly when he asked her questions, and asked questions of her own when she was curious. He was often surprised by her questions. She asked about his work with the government committee. She asked about the tenant farmers on his northern estates and whether the drainage system had been improved since the flooding 3 years ago. She asked about a painting in the hallway that depicted a man on horseback in what appeared to be North Africa, and when he told her the story behind it, a grey tunkel, a military campaign, a horse that had saved the man's life, she listened with the complete attention of someone who was genuinely interested. He found himself telling her more than he had intended. The truth about Cecilia spread through London society with the efficient speed of a well-placed rumor. Captain Whitmore and Cecilia Ashford were confirmed to have eloped to Scotland. The story was told in drawing rooms and at dinner tables with various degrees of scandal and sympathy. And alongside it ran the other story, the one about the Duke of Wexford, who had arrived at the altar expecting one woman and left it married to another, and who had apparently made no complaint about it whatsoever. Eleanor, once invisible, became the most discussed woman in London. People who had never looked at her twice now looked at her carefully, trying to understand what they had missed. She was invited to teas and evening events as the Duchess of Wexford, a title that still felt slightly strange to her, and she attended them with the quiet composure that was simply her natural way of moving through the world. At a grand autumn ball, 3 months after the wedding, Eleanor descended the staircase of Wexford House into a room full of London society. She wore the Wexford sapphires, which were old and famous and heavy, and a dress the color of deep water. She had not changed herself to fit the position. She had simply settled into it, the way a person settles into a chair that turns out to be exactly the right size. She was standing near the far window, engaged in a conversation about irrigation methods with a retired agricultural engineer who was clearly delighted to have found someone interested in the topic, when the Duke crossed the room toward her. She saw him coming. She did not pretend otherwise. He reached her, inclined his head slightly to the engineer in a polite dismissal, and then stood before her. The noise of the room continued all around them, but between them there was a small, particular silence. "Will you dance, Duchess?" he said. It was the first time he had said the title with warmth in his voice. It was a small thing. She noticed it. "I will," she said. He led her to the floor, and the other couple stepped back without being asked, the way people naturally make space for something they recognize as significant. They danced without pretending it was less than it was, two people who had found themselves bound together by a strange accident of circumstance, and had decided, each in their own way, that honesty was better than performance. He had gone to the altar expecting a particular kind of woman. What he had found instead was a woman who had walked into one of the hardest situations of her life with her eyes open, told him the truth when she had every reason not to, and then simply gotten on with things. It was not what he had planned. He was beginning to think it was considerably better. And Alina, who had spent her whole life being the sister who didn't matter, the daughter who wasn't chosen, the woman in the corner of the room, danced in the center of the room and understood, for the first time, that the wrong ending sometimes opens the door to a story that is far better than the one anyone had planned to tell.